Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a really important question. How can our cities be better places for families?
Yeah, how can they really support families?
Exactly. And you, our listener, gave us some great starting points. We've got this detailed PDF full of research, case studies,
Lots to unpack there.
definitely. And also, this simple image you shared, mere grass, more grass.
That says a lot right away, doesn't it? That desire for green space.
It really does. So our mission today is to dig into the evidence, figure out what really makes a city work for families with young kids.
Exactly. We'll be looking at findings from urban planning, some practical examples, cities like Dublin, Eindhoven, Jerusalem.
And crucially, right, how kids themselves can actually have a say in shaping their own cities.
That's a key piece, yeah. How they can and should be involved.
Okay, so let's start with something really fundamental. Outdoor play. We all remember it, probably, but the research shows just how vital it is.
Oh, absolutely. It's huge. And it's way more than just, kids running around burning off energy. Outdoor play is where so much social learning happens, kids figuring out how to negotiate, share, see things from another perspective. It's obviously critical for motor skills too, big movements, small movements. But what's really striking, I think, is the impact on cognitive development.
Yeah, so?
Well, it seems to boost learning, creativity, even things like concentration. And then there's the health side, of course.
Yeah, the physical health benefits.
Definitely. It's a major factor in preventing childhood obesity, other chronic diseases later on. It's foundational.
And it's really interesting to see this understanding sort of filtering into urban planning now.
It is. There's a growing recognition.
It's not just about having parks anymore, is it? It's about thinking, okay, how can the whole city offer chances for play while keeping things safe and healthy, obviously?
Exactly. It feels like a real shift. And part of that shift is realizing children aren't just, passive residents. They experience the city very differently, and they actually have really valuable insights into what's working and what isn't.
Like what kinds of insights?
Oh, anything from pointing out where traffic feels dangerous to them to imagining how some, neglected patch of ground could be turned into something useful for the community.
That makes so much sense. I mean, who knows the walk to school better than the kid who does it every single day?
Precisely.
Yet it feels like these voices, the kids' voices, they're often just missing when cities are being planned or changed.
That's a really critical point. The research increasingly says involve them, but the reality on the ground is often that they're excluded. But there are important frameworks pushing back against that, like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child back in 1990.
Right, I remember seeing that mentioned.
It explicitly recognizes participation as a fundamental right for children. And then you have programs like UNESCO's MOST program, which actively tries to support getting young people involved in local decisions.
Okay, so if we agree kids should be involved, how do we actually do it? You can't exactly hand a planning survey to a 4-year-old, can you?
No, definitely not. The methods have got to fit the age group. Driscoll's research from 2002 had some good ideas here.
What?
Well, for younger kids, sometimes just careful observation, watching how they use a space, what they gravitate towards, what they avoid, that tells you a lot.
No.
Drawings are great too. Letting them visually show you their world, their ideas, even things like role-playing or acting out scenarios can really help understand their experience.
Interesting. And for older kids?
For older children, discussion groups can work really well, like Kirby and others suggested in 2003. But the key, as Bell, Vroman, and Colin pointed out later, is flexibility.
Flexibility.
Yeah, like being flexible with timing, making sure the kids feel a real sense of ownership over the process. Otherwise, it just feels like another school assignment,
Okay.
It has to be meaningful engagement.
Got it. So it really needs to be tailored. What about the really little ones, like preschoolers? Is there much research there?
It's an area that's still developing, I'd say. But the Reggio Emilia approach in early education is a standout example.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, it's famous for being very child-led. It really focuses on creating environments where even very young kids can explore, express themselves, and kind of shape their own learning space. It definitely suggests the potential is there, even at that age.
This idea of people taking charge of their local environment. It reminds me of something else in the sources, street reclaiming. What's that about?
Street reclaiming, yeah. That concept, championed by English back in '99, it's very grassroots.
Okay.
The basic idea is that the people living on a street should have the power to prioritize human activity over cars.
So taking back the street, basically.
Exactly. It might involve residents getting together to, say, temporarily close the street to traffic or put in some traffic calming things, and then using that reclaimed space for playing, socializing, building community. It's really about empowering locals.
Right. So we've talked about why involve kids and how, but the sources also mention different levels of participation. That seems important for making sure it's not just superficial.
It really is. Hart's ladder of participation, which Driscoll also referenced, is a super useful way to think about this.
Yeah.
It basically lays out a spectrum. At the bottom, you have situations where kids are kind of manipulated or used as tokens. They're there, but they have no real say.
Not genuine participation at all.
Not at all. Then, as you move up the ladder, you get levels like assigned but informed, where kids might have a role, but it's defined by adults.
Okay.
The goal is to get to the higher rungs. Maybe it's an adult-led project, but kids share in the decision-making. Or, ideally, you reach the top where projects are actually initiated by children, driven by their ideas, and adults are there to support and facilitate.
That ladder really makes the differences clear. It's not just about if kids are involved, but how and how much power they actually have.
Exactly. Moving beyond just, ticking a box.
Okay, let's look at some real places. Dublin came up in the research. What have they done to try and become more child-friendly?
Dublin's a really interesting case. So Ireland ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child back in '92. Right.
That sort of laid the groundwork. Then in 2000, they developed a national children's strategy. And through consultation for that, they identified that actually play facilities were a real problem area.
So a recognized need.
A recognized need, yes.
Yeah.
Which then led to a national play policy document in 2004, formally saying, yes, play is fundamentally important.
So identifying the problem, making policy, that's a start.
Yeah.
But did things change on the ground?
Well, one significant step following the strategy was establishing these Comhairle NATO youth councils across the country from 2002.
Youth councils.
Yeah, basically platforms for young people to have a voice on local services and policies that affect them.
Okay, that's direct involvement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But specifically looking at play in Dublin, the big thing was the 2012 Dublin City Play Plan. It had this great title, Play Here, Play There, Play Everywhere.
I love that. Me too. It really captures the goal. This was a joint effort between the City Council and the Dublin Youth Council. They looked closely at the existing play stuff infrastructure and made recommendations for putting play opportunities into public spaces, into schools, really embedding it.
Play here, play there, play everywhere. Yeah, that really sums up the ideal, doesn't it? Now, the sources also mentioned something about how we see families in cities. Apparently, that view has changed over time.
That's right. There was definitely a period, especially sort of mid-20th century with suburban growth, where families with kids were almost seen as non-typical city dwellers.
Like cities weren't really for families.
Kind of. The prevailing idea was that the suburbs were the natural place for raising kids.
And why was that? What drove that idea?
Well, several things. A big one was housing the feeling that there wasn't enough affordable family-size housing in cities.
Okay, cost, space.
Yeah, the general cost of living was higher too. And then you had the powerful pull of the suburban dream, more space, quieter streets, a garden, easy access to green.
Right, the classic image, a mix of practical issues and perceived benefits elsewhere. But you're saying that might be changing. The sources suggest a shift.
Precisely. The research points to a growing number of families choosing city life. It fits with this broader trend of people being more interested in urban living again, and that includes young families.
Interesting.
Yeah, you see it reflected in things like the Dutch government's Agenda Stad initiative from 2015, which aimed to boost cities but also recognize families were increasingly part of that urban picture. And a report from PBL in the Netherlands that same year highlighted cities becoming more attractive again for lots of groups, including young families.
That's really important context as we dive into the specifics. We've got these case studies, Eindhoven in the Netherlands and Jerusalem in Israel. Let's start with Eindhoven. How do they study family life there?
The Eindhoven study was pretty thorough, using what they call a mixed methods approach. So they looked at streets, green spaces, play areas, using a mix of things. Direct observation, surveys, mapping exercises where people showed their routes, and also in-depth interviews.
Who'd they talk to?
They interviewed 204 families with kids under 12 living in both inner city and more suburban-style neighborhoods. That represented about 407 kids altogether.
Wow, quite a few.
Yeah. And they zoomed in on one inner city area that was actually seeing a small rise in families moving in. It's also worth noting these neighborhoods were generally pretty well connected to the city center, walkable, cyclable, or good public transport.
Sounds like they got a lot of different kinds of information. What were some of the main things they found in Eindhoven?
Well, they focused on four specific neighborhoods: Bergen, Blixenbosch Oost, Lakerlopen, and Wenzel West. And these areas were quite different
Different how?
in terms of things like population density, the mix of people living their age, ethnic background. For example, Wenzel West and Lakerlopen had more social housing, a higher proportion of residents with non-Western backgrounds compared to the city average. And that often correlated with lower average incomes, property values.
Okay, so diverse neighborhoods.
Very. And the researchers made these really detailed maps showing the walking routes people reported using, so you could visually see how people moved around each area.
Ah, that's clever.
Yeah. And interestingly, their analysis showed that most people in all four neighborhoods actually had access to some kind of green space, either amenity green or aesthetic green, within about 600 meters.
So, on paper at least, green space access wasn't terrible.
Generally, yeah, within that radius.
But what about people's actual experience walking around? Did the qualitative stuff, the interviews, tell a different story? Let's take Bergen first.
Bergen was interesting because it's kind of hemmed in by major roads. One street in particular, Grootberg, really acts like a divider, splitting the neighborhood into a north and south part with different feelings.
Okay.
And here's a slightly odd finding. Even though Grootberg had a lot of traffic, residents actually tended to perceive it as relatively safe.
Huh. High traffic, but felt safe. Strange.
What about Wenzel West?
Wenzel West seemed less popular for walking compared to Bergen. People acknowledged things were improving there. There was investment happening.
Okay.
But they could still point to specific streets they'd rather avoid, maybe because of traffic, maybe because of, activities they didn't like seeing. And perceived safety there definitely varied depending on the time of day. Evenings felt less safe to some.
Right, and Lakerlopen.
In Lakerlopen, the popular walking route seems clustered more in the northern part. The southern area along the canal was less appealing, probably because of more commercial or industrial stuff going on there. The source didn't give us specific qualitative bits on Blixenbosch-Lust's walking experience in this section, though. Got it. So even within one city, big differences in how people experience just walking around. Okay, let's talk street design and safety. Obviously huge for families. What did Eindhoven tell us there?
Well, the Netherlands has this national policy called Sustainable Safety, started back in '97. It's quite proactive.
The sustainable safety, what does that mean?
Basically, it aims to prevent crashes before they happen by designing the whole road system with human users and human errors in mind.
Designing for mistakes.
Exactly. The core idea is that the system should be forgiving, and it stresses that safety is a shared responsibility between road users and the people designing and managing the roads.
Makes sense. Are there specific principles?
Yeah, 5 key ones. Functionality roads should clearly signal their purpose. Homogeneity, speeds, and directions should be consistent on similar road types. Predictability road design and user behavior should be easy to anticipate. Forgivingness, minimizing crash consequences. And state awareness, making sure users are alert to the conditions.
That sounds really comprehensive, very thought through. But how did it play out for the families in the study? Did they feel safe?
Well, that's the interesting thing. Despite this strong policy, safety concerns definitely came up from both parents and kids. And often the kids reported feeling less safe than their parents did.
Really?
Yeah. In one workshop in Bergen, only about a third of the kids felt the streets were safe enough to play on.
Only a third. Wow.
But, and this is key, half of those same kids still played out on the street regularly.
Why? If they didn't feel safe?
Mostly because there weren't many designated playgrounds nearby, so it was the only option.
Okay. A trade-off.
Exactly. And this lines up with other research showing road safety is a huge worry, and that lots of traffic and parked cars really negatively affect how kids feel about their neighborhood. In that Bergen workshop, parents specifically suggested lowering the speed limit on that busy Grootberg Street.
Right. A practical suggestion based on their experience. That
Yeah.
really shows the tension between needing play space and dealing with traffic reality. Okay, what about the green spaces and play areas themselves in Eindhoven?
Well, the study obviously confirmed what we generally know: urban green space is crucial for learning, behavior, health, social connection, all sorts of things.
Right.
They mentioned Richard Louv's work too, the whole nature deficit disorder idea. Basically, kids not getting enough nature contact can be detrimental, while more greenery has positive impacts: responsibility, environmental awareness, cognitive stuff, social skills.
That definitely echoes the mere grass image, doesn't it? People instinctively want more green. What were the specifics in Eindhoven, though? What did people want or worry about?
In Bergen specifically, there was this clear wish from parents and kids for more dedicated spots where they could just gather and hang out, beyond the few scattered playgrounds.
More social spaces.
Yeah. And while a lot of improvement ideas focused on upgrading the official play areas, the kids in Bergen also really valued the undesignated green spots, bits of grass, little corners, mainly because they were closer to home, easier to get to.
Interesting. Proximity matters.
Definitely. There were also some gender differences in Bergen. Girls seemed more concerned about maintenance, things looking run down, and also about older teenagers hanging around, which made them feel less comfortable.
Okay.
Boys, on the other hand, were more focused on wanting better facilities for sports, like improving the soccer field.
Different priorities.
Yeah. But on a really positive note, Bergen had this great example of community action called Stadsstuen Bergen.
And Shadstuen, city garden.
Exactly. Residents basically took over an old parking space and a rundown playground, got some funding from the municipality and help from local groups, and turned it into this really nice green space for everyone to use, play in, interact.
That's fantastic. A real bottom-up success story.
Yeah, okay.
Let's switch gears to Jerusalem. How did they approach studying child friendliness there?
The Jerusalem research was mainly done by master's students in planning, actually, from the Hebrew University.
Right.
They focused on 4 different neighborhoods: Shmuel Hanavi, Telpi Estates, Katamonim, and Beit Hanina. And they used structured observations, basically checklists looking for specific child-friendly features.
Right.
They also did structured interviews with parents in those areas. The main goal was to see how the physical environment, as assessed by the students, related to how the parents actually experienced living there with kids.
So again, mixing observation with residents' perspectives. What were some of the main findings when they compared those 4 Jerusalem neighborhoods?
They put together a comparison table looking at things like the number of playgrounds, other open spaces, the amount and quality of green space.
And what stood out?
Well, Shmuel Hanavi was flagged for poor street safety, fast traffic, not enough traffic calming. In Talpiot Estates, parents said their kids played outside daily, often in playgrounds or these semi-public spaces within housing areas.
Okay, so kids were playing out.
They were. But those semi-public spaces in Talpiot, even though they were well distributed, were often poorly maintained, and some parents felt they weren't very safe.
Ah, the maintenance issue again.
Exactly. Katamonim had things like traffic lights and speed bumps, but strangely, not enough speed limit signs, especially near schools. And a big problem there was sidewalks being blocked.
Blocked by what?
Parked cars, big garbage bins, poorly placed signs or posts, just making it hard to walk.
Frustrating.
Yeah. And Beit Hanina's issues seem to stem more from unplanned development and governance problems, just poor maintenance overall, and a lack of basic infrastructure in public spaces.
It sounds like each neighborhood had its own distinct set of problems.
Right.
So if we pull back and look at both Eindhoven and Jerusalem, what are the big takeaways? What did comparing them reveal?
Well, one really key finding was that just counting the number of playgrounds didn't directly predict how much kids played outside.
Oh, interesting. More playgrounds doesn't automatically equal more play.
Apparently not. It suggests other things are just as, if not more, important, like safety, how easy it is to get there, the quality of the space, the whole environment around it.
Right. What else?
A theme that came up in both places was the need for play spaces that work for a wider range of ages. In Eindhoven, they also specifically mentioned needing more gender-inclusive designs. In Jerusalem, the focus was maybe more on needing a greater variety of activity centers, maybe including indoor options, too.
And maintenance.
Huge concern in both. Better upkeep of existing parks and green spaces was a clear need everywhere they looked.
That seems like such a basic thing, but obviously crucial. Any other major differences or similarities?
The study did contrast the planning systems. The Netherlands, generally has more established regulations, which you could see in Eindhoven. Jerusalem, especially East Jerusalem, showed more visible signs of urban complexity, like all the parked cars blocking sidewalks, suggesting maybe weaker regulatory enforcement or mechanisms.
Okay, different context.
Different contexts, yeah. But despite that, traffic safety was a massive primary concern for parents and kids in all the neighborhoods studied in both cities.
Safety first, always.
Pretty much. And another interesting idea they floated was that if you design housing areas really well, with safe, appealing little spots for informal play right there, that might actually compensate somewhat if there aren't enough formal playgrounds nearby.
building play into the fabric of the neighborhood itself.
Exactly. Thinking beyond the designated playground.
So based on all this, what kinds of recommendations did the researchers make? How can cities actually do better?
They grouped them into three main areas: greenscapes, playscapes, and street networks.
Okay, greenscapes first.
For greenscapes, things like more street trees, greening initiatives, maybe using social media to build community around local green spaces.
Right, playscapes.
For playscapes, adding more things kids can climb on or interact with, using different paving textures to signal play zones, trying out temporary street closures for like those play out events. Also, creating more natural play areas with things like logs and rocks, not just plastic equipment.
Okay.
And visually connecting important places for kids with clear child routes. Designing for flexibility so kids with different abilities can use the space, and building good cycle path networks.
Lots of ideas there. And street networks.
A big one was fostering that shared responsibility for safety we talked about earlier.
Right, everyone plays a part.
Exactly. Plus a whole list of smaller, micro-level things. Playful street furniture, painting games on sidewalks, using visual tricks or physical bumps to narrow streets and slow traffic. Better lighting, just better maintenance and awareness. Also, making schoolyards more available for play outside school hours, using semi-private spaces in housing areas better, making street crossings more fun and visible, even things like junkyard playgrounds where kids can build and create with loose parts.
Wow, that's a comprehensive list. From big strategies down to small touches.
It really is. And they strongly emphasized, again, the value of involving residents, especially kids and parents, in figuring out the problems and coming up with solutions, like that Stadstuenbergen project in Eindhoven.
Yeah, the community garden.
Exactly. They even showed a design proposal from Bergen where they suggested dividing streets into play streets and infrastructure streets to specifically tackle unsafe roads and improve a playground that wasn't working well.
That really highlights that it's not just one solution, is it? It's got to be tailored.
Absolutely. It needs that holistic view, considering all these different layers and the specific context of each place.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've really dug into the research, the examples. It's clear making cities truly family-friendly is complex. What's the main takeaway message you think people should leave with?
I think the core message is that it really does require this multi-layered approach. It's not enough to just build a few playgrounds and call it done.
Right.
You have to seriously consider street safety, access to good green space, genuinely involving children in planning, and really understanding the unique vibe and needs of different neighborhoods within the city. It all has to work together.
It all connects. So thinking about everything we've covered today, here's a final thought for you, our listener, to maybe chew on. How could your own neighborhood be reimagined? What could make it better support children's play, their development, their well-being? What changes, small or maybe even big, could create a more nurturing, more engaging environment for families right where you live? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.